Okay, so as I said today, I'm going to be going through my most recent paper, which was examining the inside workings of a steroid importation, brewing and supply operation in the southwest of England. So this has been accepted by the journal Performance Enhancement and Health. You can see I've included the DOI there, so you can all search it and gain access to it at present. And the paper was about my experiences speaking to somebody who was very involved in steroid supply in the southwest. And he was in charge of it was a mid-level operation, but it was one of the larger ones in the region. And it kind of ties in with my broader ethnographic findings of steroid supply in gyms and so on, as we'll see. So this paper, it offers a really interesting example of international issues in drug supply, cross-border supply of drugs, as well as local market contexts and sort of some of the norms around how supply occurs in these more local regional spaces. And as we will see, informs debates around drug harms, drug policy. So let's begin. So why this research, essentially? Well, image and performance enhancing drugs, of which steroids are sort of the main ones that we deal with, they've been an increasing concern for researchers, for policymakers and so on in recent years. Sort of since around 2010-ish, I suppose, maybe earlier, 2009, I think, there were publications saying about actually there's been a rise in use of these drugs, and particularly in more recent years with sort of cultural trends, you know, aesthetics culture and simultaneously wellness culture, perhaps ironically. Particularly in recent years, there has been an increase in use and thus an increase in focus on potential harms that could be associated with use. So I've given you some examples there, Kimagod and McVeigh's work, for instance, discussing policy implications of harms from the increasing use of steroids. So there's been what appears to be a normalization of these drugs, and my doctoral thesis was on that. Kumar et al. Talked about that in their paper I cited there. And of course, part of understanding, you know, the policy perspectives and potential harms linked to normalization of product is also understanding how access occurs. How are people accessing these drugs, and what potential harms can we discuss in relation to that and the drug supply, which of course is the purpose of this paper. So Hall and Antonopoulos talk about the online illicit medicines market and actually how people are able now to access illicit drugs or counterfeit medicines far more easily than they were ever able to before, and how cross-border supply is becoming somewhat normalized in this internet era. And this paper aims to actually look at some of the local market impacts of this. So again, just to kind of theorize the paper, Ross Coomer's work, as I've mentioned to you guys in previous sessions, Ross Coomer talked about some of these myths around the heroin market and heroin supply and these misunderstandings. And really this paper seeks to do the same thing for the steroids market, have a really in-depth, inside exploration of how the steroid market operates from importation through local market manufacture and into local market supply, particularly in gyms, and sort of try and help give us a bit more evidence-based policy discussion. Understand more of the realities of supply. So in terms of the methodology for this paper, obviously gaining access to drug suppliers, particularly above a certain level, can be quite difficult. In terms of social suppliers, people involved in the casual supply of drugs, not necessarily that hard for researchers to access them. But if you go sort of a level above in the market towards more commercial suppliers, it can be quite hard to get that inside access if you're looking to actually explore the inner workings and the realities of these markets. So what happened was, in my ethnographic research in gyms, I spoke to quite a few people who were involved in social supply. They would say, oh yeah, I had a friend who wanted this, so I got him that. But that was quite normal. There's a lot of social supply of steroids and other IPEDs happens in gyms. When we look a level higher, however, to sort of the commercial suppliers, those who are actively involved in sort of distributing to a lot of different gyms, and maybe selling to gym owners who then conduct that kind of social supply within gyms, actually they were a lot harder for me to access. So if you saw my presentation last year talking about some of the methodological and ethical issues I faced in my research, I mentioned this guy Tyson, who spoke to me. He was a high-level steroid supplier, but he was very cagey in what he told me, and he sort of threatened he would send the boys around if he had any problems from our interview. So in terms of actual solid inside data, really examining the realities of these markets, this really all came from one person in my research, a participant named Jim, nicknamed Jim, pseudonym. So this was a case study, but why was Jim a sufficient participant for me to form a case study of his answers? There is a requirement. If you're just doing a single case study, obviously you have to select very knowledgeable participants, people who can really give you a solid understanding of the area. And Jim, being a national level competitive powerlifter, former champion in his weight class in powerlifting, he knew a lot about the sport, he knew a lot about IPEDs and the culture in gyms, and also, as we will see, his supply operation, fairly significant spread. So he was quite suitable for a case study. At the same time, because I've been conducting this much broader ethnography, looking at supply in sort of lower level context, social supply in gyms and so on, as well as my research into the online supply of steroids, actually I had quite a detailed ethnography as a whole examining sort of broader context of supply. So I was able to draw on this in my study of gyms' specific experiences and turn this into a sort of ethnographic case study. And then because I'm, as you'll see, very reliant on Jim's voice, Jim's narrative, how he actually represents, portrays his story, I sort of said this is kind of an ethnographic narrative case study of the market. And I've drawn on Kraska et al. Did a similar thing in the United States, talking to a high-level bodybuilder who was involved in the supply, well, the importation, manufacture, and supply of steroids. What distinguishes my work from Kraska et al.'s is that Jim also had a degree in chemistry. He had a background in chemistry, he had experience in lab work. So actually, whereas previous work has looked at experts who have been bodybuilders and high-level sportsmen, this work brings more of an academic element as well. So when we're discussing Jim's operation, you'll notice a few times he'll say things that tie in with his expertise in chemistry. So this certainly made him a very interesting person to talk to as a case study participant in this area. But as I've noted, the final point that is relevant to the methodology is that Jim was actually a friend of mine. We've known each other since we were 16. He was the one who actually got me involved in powerlifting in the first place, which kind of determined what I did my PhD on and everything that happened since. So I've just made a note that obviously this kind of affects my positionality in what I'm representing to you guys. I might have certain biases in advance, and how I navigated sort of our relationship is relevant to keep in mind. But nonetheless, let's move on to the findings. So the first thing that I wanted to examine was actually how people come to be commercial suppliers of these drugs. And one of the ways was very similar to other drug markets. If you look at some of the research on other drug markets, I've given some examples, Adler and Taylor and Potter, actually there's this description of drift into becoming a supplier. People initially start looking to cover the costs of their own use of drugs as users, and then this opens up opportunities to start supplying friends, which then moves into broader social supply, and then they drift into commercial supply. And Taylor and Potter's paper particularly details this in relation to club drugs. So regarding his own experiences, Jim actually said that when he was first looking to use steroids, he accessed them through these social supply means just in a gym. He was in the gym, kind of everybody in gyms is aware of who's selling, people know who to talk to. So Jim said, I just spoke to somebody at the gym, found someone that was selling and gave him some money. And he got the drugs in return for that. So very much based in social supply, very much based in that kind of ease of access. But what happened after, in Jim's case, that distinguishes him somewhat, is he then had a friend suggest to him that actually there was this online source he could speak to, somebody this friend had been in contact with, who actually was able to, you could get drugs a lot cheaper from this source. So Jim's initial access to steroids was very normal, something that's seen all across the research, my own, Coumarin, Salinas, and so on. But in the next phase, what happened was Jim had access to this online source, this person who was based in Ireland and was shipping product in a bit more bulk and quite cheaply. And Jim notes that he knew a few people who wanted things in his local gym, and that he would then be able to offset the cost of his use, as discussed in those other papers such as Adler. So what happened was Jim had this access, and as a result, as he notes, friends know you're selling it, and then they'll talk to people that say, where'd you get that from? Then all of a sudden you've got maybe 40 people after things, and then some of those will be buying to pass on to other people, and the chain starts from there. So he's very rapidly found himself in a situation where, because he can access product very cheaply, and word has gotten around, now people are actually asking him, hey, can I buy in bulk from you to then sell to other people in other gyms? And they set up their more sort of social supply operations. So that shows how Jim drifted into this higher level of supply just from initially buying product for himself and then being able to get it cheaper, meant that he wound up actually becoming a supplier. And as he notes, he was a competitive powerlifter, so he had a lot of contacts. And actually, he knew that there were people, he was based in the southwest, and he knew people up in Glasgow were using the product that he was bringing in. So actually, it was quite a widespread operation by the time it sort of hit its peak. So let's talk about the drugs themselves, because this is very relevant to understand when we're talking about market operations, is that the vast majority of steroids that you will find in gyms are not pharmaceutical quality. A lot of them claim to be. This one, for instance, GB Pharma, says pharma on it, kind of winking, hey, this is pharmaceutical quality product. It in fact isn't. It's what's known as UGL, or underground lab product. And how this product is made is people import powder form steroids from countries such as China and India, are the big ones, and they'll buy from labs in those countries, whether legitimate pharmaceutical labs or not. A lot of them are sort of legitimate labs creating legal supplements who are then selling these products on the black market. And what happens is people get in contact with these labs generally through the internet, and then they buy powder form steroids from them, and it happens with other illicit medicines as well, things like Xanax and other benzos this occurs for. But interesting in steroids particularly because, of course, they're not sold in powder form, by and large. Most steroids are sold in injectable form. So there's a brewing process, what's called a brewing process, where people actually buy steroids in powder form and then they have to make them up with oils, with alcohol, put them in vials and put them out for sale, which people then inject. So I've just included two examples just to show you very clearly. These were ones from 2013, as you can see the date on the vial, and the other ones from 2015, of examples of this underground product, where this has been brought in powder form, brewed into an injectable form in the local market, and then sold in gyms. Now, Denham did an exploration of the various court cases, examined all the court cases relating to steroids that went through the US courts in a certain region for, I think, something like a 4-year time period. And a lot of those higher level cases are based on this practice of importing powder form steroids from other countries such as China and then home brewing them into injectable product. And some of the studies in the UK seem to suggest it's quite prevalent here. We'll draw on my doctoral thesis a bit later. I'll have some quotes from that. But certainly there is a perception that there's a lot of what's termed bathtub brew in UK gyms, which is, self-explanatory. People have bought it in powder form and brewed it into oil in their bathtub and then put it in vials. But Kumar et al.'s work also says that actually a lot of what seems to be a legitimate steroid product is counterfeit, or it's fake, or it's just underdosed, indicating it's not actual pharmaceutical grade. So this does seem to be a very prevalent practice. And of course this year, in the time I was writing up this paper, you can see this just getting reported 14th of November. So this was sort of as I was doing the minor corrections to get this finally published, there's this case, criminal boss behind huge international steroid network jailed, and if you just read the highlighted section there, inside the labs, raw powder would be converted into a liquid solution that could be injected and sold in vials. And that's the biggest steroid operation in the UK. So this is how it operates, and this is what Jim was doing, which is why this work is quite relevant, given this is currently in the news. So given this prevalence of underground lab product in local markets, obviously understanding the process of how powder form steroids are accessed through the internet, how they are imported in order to then manufacture, to brew into the injectable form, is quite significant. Because it gives us information on cross-border supply and some of the issues relating to that, which Hall and Antonopoulos covered in relation to illicit medicines, and also might help to clarify local market contexts a bit more, given we've noted most product in the local market is of this origin. So, Jim's experience with cross-border supply. Initially, as I said, he was ordering from somebody in Ireland. So he was ordering finished product. He was ordering injectable vials, getting them sent from Ireland, and then he was supplying those. Now, what happened was this online contact who he was speaking to in Ireland, as Jim says, essentially stopped what he was doing, and he then gave me a contact in China, which of course is where the raw powders were coming from. So Jim actually took over the kind of middleman role that this person in Ireland had been performing, importing from China, making it up himself in Ireland and then shipping to the UK, and Jim took over that and started doing that from Plymouth. So again, we kind of see the role of drift in how he came to have this status in the market, but discussing what happened once he was given this contact in China, this person working at a lab in China, he notes actually it became very easy for him to order a lot of steroids. So as we can see from the quotes here, he said he'd sent a few £100 via Western Union to this lab in China, and in return they would ship several hundred grams at a time in powder form of steroids. And he said that was enough to make about 100 bottles every single batch, which sort of would equate to about £3,000 per batch for a couple of £100. Obviously more costs in the actual manufacturing stage. So it was quite easy for him once he had this contact to actually send them money. It was all done by Western Union, and then they would just ship it through the post, and he would receive it. So discussing this, receiving the powder, how importation actually works, cross-border supply, Jim actually said there wasn't much concern regarding seizures, because he actually had a couple of packages seized, and he said, you might get a strongly worded letter in the post telling you not to do it again, and you'd lose your powder, but that was about it. So it's interesting to kind of think of this in the context of when we talk about prohibition and causing harms. Is there actually a strong prohibition? There seems to be a de facto decriminalisation, particularly as far as people in gyms, people on bodybuilding forums are concerned. There's a lot of discussion about, oh, it's really easy to get through UK customs, and don't worry, you can just say, oh, that wasn't my package, and then all they can kind of do is send you a letter. So that's an interesting thing to think about. But building on sort of Hall, Conrad and Antonopoulos' work, there's also the element of actually, even if people aren't going to face prison sentences, they still don't want their products seized. So it's interesting to note how these companies, these lab suppliers in places like China and India, actually try to minimize detection and actually try and ensure that their packages get through. So I asked Jim about what happens in those cases where your product gets seized, and he said the majority of people will resend it once, some might even resend it until you receive the powder. If you pay a little bit more, they'll happily resend it. So now this is kind of an insurance mechanism that's actually already in place. These Chinese labs, because they're aware that they're selling this in a country where it's illegal to sell it, actually already have insurance in place to deal with what happens at Western borders. So they have discrete packaging, they have ways to try and sneak it through. And of course, Jim buying, say, 100 or a couple of 100 grams at a time, that was obviously very different to the people mass importing as we saw in that news report. Perhaps a little easier to get away with. But also, how they already have these mechanisms in place, like, no, you can pay for special insurance up front, and then we'll just keep sending it until you get it. So it kind of incentivizes them to make sure packages get through. So from a kind of international policy perspective and regarding cross-border supply of drugs more generally, that's quite an interesting finding. What it also speaks to is actually the prevalence of this. Because there's been a few papers regarding how prevalent is homebrewing. This is becoming something that's actually being discussed now, the whole idea of illicit medicine manufacture in the local market and homebrewing phenomenon more broadly. But actually, Jim said, oh, customs got stricter around the London Olympics, which was in 2012. So they already had these mechanisms in place. These Chinese suppliers were already taking orders from people online, and they already had these kind of insurance mechanisms in place. When we're talking about 2012, Jim was doing this through to about 2015. So it speaks somewhat to actually, this might have been quite a prevalent practice earlier than people realise. And Krasker et al., that 2010 paper, is really the only paper from about that kind of time which was discussing it at an academic level, and that was in the US. So, but it seems, actually, that it may well have been quite prevalent during that same period. And therefore, obviously, worth exploring in a bit more detail. So, Jim, as I said, was interesting because he had a chemistry background. So his approach, perhaps, to the manufacture and local market supply was a bit different to, for instance, Krasker et al.'s respondent, who was just a high-level bodybuilder. So Jim noted that actually he received these powder form steroids, which he intended to brew up into liquid form to sell, but before he engaged in the brewing process, Jim actually said he conducted presumptive testing of the powders to check their purity. Why is this important? Well, Jim, coming from a chemistry background, said you can tell it's only got one compound in it from simple chromatography. It's sort of 99% plus comprised of that compound. So having the expertise and the ability just to conduct these tests at this level actually is quite significant because, of course, one of the things that is discussed in relation to drugs is how much are they cut on their way from the initial manufacturer through to the local market suppliers. It would seem, in this case, not at all. So this doesn't actually verify product strength, of course. It just shows that there are no cutting agents, because that's the simple presumptive test as opposed to doing advanced HPLC and gas chromatography and so on. But actually, it indicates there was no cutting along that supply chain from China to getting to Jim, which sort of evidences he probably was talking to a legitimate pharmaceutical lab that were kind of selling product illegally on the side, but also that perhaps some of those perceptions of, well, why is product in the local market underdosed, as Kumar et al. Found, doesn't seem to be linked to the quality of the powders initially. And I'll come to what might be the issues with those powder strengths outside of cutting. So again, sort of similar to what Ross Kumar found when talking about heroin markets, that actually there's this perception that all heroin is cut before it reaches the UK market, and he says actually about half of it isn't cut at all. So given Jim's findings when conducting presumptive testing in this manner, it's worthwhile considering why Kumar et al. Found that a lot of products seem to be way below the labelled dosage in the local market, or why some of it appeared to be fake or just bunk. And I asked Jim about the types of product he was brewing and the kind of supply he was involved in, and I think this is actually a very informative quote, because I asked him, did you sell human growth hormone and other peptide hormones and that sort of thing? And he said no, because a bag of testosterone, unless you store it in 100-degree heat or something, it's not going to degrade very rapidly. Whereas growth hormone will have to be stored in a fridge the whole time. Any sort of moisture, any sort of heat can completely destroy it. So it's possible some of these fakes and this bunk product seen on the local market, this isn't the result of sort of nefarious cutting or anything like that. It could well be the result of people simply not being aware of these storage use, because Jim, as a chemist, was aware of this. But people such as Krasker's bodybuilder might not have been aware that actually, no, you have to keep it refrigerated, otherwise it's going to degrade. So it could be that storage, transportation conditions, that sort of thing, is just causing a natural degradation of some of these products to the point where they become, as Jim says, essentially a vial full of salt. But this isn't to rule out other issues that perhaps are linked to these products. So let's take a look at the actual brewing process itself, because that's very significant to understanding kind of the quality of product and context of supply and sale. So Llewellyn and Tober talk about brewing. Again, sort of a contemporary article to Saska's, this book Underground Anabolics that came out in 2010. And they documented their experiences actually talking to the lab owners of the British Dragon lab, which was quite a famous lab back in the day, underground lab of brewers. And they said actually it's very simple. If you wanted to create a basic product, you can just mix powders, if you get access to powders, with oil and alcohol, and immediately, just heat it and it would be usable. But Jim went somewhat against this because he wanted to create a high quality product. He had access to this powder that he knew was pure, that hadn't been cut with anything from his own presumptive testing as a chemist. And he said he started tinkering with brewing this in his own home, but realised that actually in practice he wouldn't be able to create a high quality product on a large scale doing this. So he says he knew someone else that was more of an established steroid supplier. I had a chat with him saying what I could get, and we started brewing it. So this established supplier, he had the space, he had his own flat with spare rooms, so he had the capacity. He also had some resources, being an established steroid supplier, to actually be able to buy lab equipment. So what seems to have happened is this individual provided the capital, and Jim, as a chemist, who also had access to pure powders, kind of provided the human capital, the technical know-how. So I didn't ask specifically on how this relationship came about, so I can't say definitively, but it would seem that Jim was saying, hey, if you can give me the space and give me a lab, I can create a really good product for you to sell. Appears to be what happened. So regarding setting up this lab in this individual's house, Jim actually said it was quite easy to set up a lab, because you can acquire most of the equipment you'd need from an online lab supply company. Everything you'd need, completely legal. And as a chemist, he knew precisely what he would need. He knew the sites he would have to access. He said, we got all the various pumps and filters and the vials, as well as things like ethyl oleate. Apparently, you just order it online, nothing suspicious, not seen as dodgy at all. So he was able to set up this lab in a spare room in this established supplier's flat to actually create high-end product. And Llewellyn and Tober do talk about another lab doing that in the end of their book. So, if we just jump back to product quality quickly in relation to the brewing process, what having a lab of this type allowed, as opposed to just kind of brewing up in one's home, as we said, it's a simple process, but in order to ensure sterility, if you're brewing it up in a not overly cleanly environment, what's called bathtub brew, you need to put more alcohol in, because that's used to sterilize. And alcohol is very painful when injected, if there's too much of it. So in my broader ethnography, talking to people in gyms, actually one of the main reasons that product would gain a bad reputation is that injecting it was painful, caused discomfort. And that could well be caused by alcohol. So actually, by having this kind of lab and separate clean room and being able to manufacture the steroids, so to speak, in a cleaner manner, meant less alcohol was needed. So the qualitative experience of injecting was better. So in terms of creating the high-end product, a lot of that is just based on end-user perception. Can we make it less painful to actually inject? So Jim was able to ensure that his product wouldn't have this issue that actually product in the local market had a bit of a bad reputation for, because he had the equipment to actually make sterile product without having to swamp it with quite much alcohol. Alcohol obviously still needed to dissolve the powder into the oils, but not in such high quantities. And talking about the product, obviously I said about the spread of the product, reached as far north as Glasgow. He actually said several strongmen on the national stage and above were using it, and he did name names. So it does seem, based on my knowledge of strongman, that it must have had a good reputation if those people were using it. But of course, all anonymous. So obviously Jim's chemistry experience, very relevant in how he came to create this product. And also he was able to offer insight into some of those other examples we see in the literature, such as Krasker et al.'s exploration of a similar lab in the US. Jim was able to sort of indicate where his lab was a bit different and inform that literature. So following on from this brewing process, where Jim and this established seller, they created a product from raw powders that they could sell in gyms, it's worth exploring actually how the local market operation worked at this level. Because there's research, obviously my doctoral thesis touches on this, Kumar and Salinas talk about this, of how social supply operates in gyms, what the norms are, how supply kind of occurs. And we saw it earlier with Jim just saying, oh, I just found someone I knew was selling and asked them to supply me. But what if we look a layer above in the market? So we're looking at wholesale suppliers. Jim said he had 40 people who were buying in bulk to pass on to other people in gyms, right? So if we're kind of looking at that level in the market, in the supply chain, well, what happens there? Well, something very interesting, because as we saw from those examples of bottles, vials I used earlier, you could see they were labelled and they had certain brand names on them. One was GB Pharma, one was Custom Anabolics, and there's a big range of various different brand names for underground lab product. Now I asked Jim about this. I asked him, did you sort of consciously market your product? You knew you had a high quality product because you had pure powders and you made it really sterile and you didn't have to use as much alcohol. Did you market it based on a brand? And Jim's response was really interesting. He said that actually rather than put a brand label on the product in the lab, he says the majority of things I moved myself were just in completely unlabeled bottles. People did put branded labels on them, but it wasn't really anything to do with me. So this is actually a really significant finding when we're talking about quality of product in local markets and context of local market supply, because how supply operates in the local market is product gets a reputation from people who use it, which gets attached to the brand name, the lab it supposedly comes from. So people say, oh, this lab's good, this one's bad. That's the reputation, and that's what it's sold on by more kind of experienced users in the local market. Obviously, if you're just buying from your personal trainer, you just buy whatever they have. If you're buying from a gym owner or a hardcore bodybuilder, they probably have a bit more of a range, and people are slightly more informed and can say, oh, I'd rather stay away from that lab because I've heard a reputation about that, as I'll show you in a couple of slides' time. Now, if the lab that's actually creating the product is sending it out in completely unlabeled bottles and selling it to 40-odd people who are then supplying in gyms, at what level are those labels being attached? When are those brand names being attached? And are they all the same? You know, if a seller is buying from someone like Jim or Jim's business partner to then sell on in local gyms, is he putting the same label on all those? Is he putting different labels on them? An interesting thing to consider. Even if he puts the same labels on all of them, might somebody else who bought from Jim's lab then put different labels on, and those will wind up being sold in the same gym anyway, as two apparently different products? So no, if a product gets a bad reputation under one name, it's possible that the guy selling it in the gym, whether a gym owner or a bodybuilder or someone, is selling the exact same product from the exact same batch with a different label. What are the implications of that? So I find that very interesting that Jim actually says no, other people were putting the labels on them, not us at the lab. So Jim actually justified this somewhat, because he was saying one of the issues that suppliers face in gyms is people trying to extort them, sort of particular bodybuilders or people who feel entitled to products say, hey, let me try some of your stuff for free, or I'm just going to tell people it's shit. And you know, I'm the big dog in the gym, so everyone's going to listen to me. So this apparently is an issue that sellers face regarding their product. So Jim actually noted that by selling non-branded product in these unlabeled bottles, actually he was able to somewhat get around this, because in these cases, the majority of people they were telling that it was bad quality were already using the things themselves, whether they knew they were or didn't. they were, and they knew exactly what it was all like. So again, this person's trying to spread bad rumours about, oh, this is poor quality product, and Jim's saying, but in that gym it's already being sold under a different brand name, so people actually already know how good that product is, and we'll just keep pushing it under this different brand name if we're going to get a negative reputation. So obviously he wasn't involved in the branding. I think he's just talking about the rationale of the people perhaps one level below him in the supply chain. But I think that's a very interesting finding, that actually it's kind of an insurance mechanism against this type of extortion that people were trying to conduct against them. And Jim actually said he knew of another lab based in the Southwest who was doing the same. One of their brands was called ISIS, which was seemed like inappropriate naming convention, given this was about 2015, and they put out a different brand name, but an identical product. It was all made at the same time. So he says, actually, this is quite a common thing. So it is this kind of rational means of navigating these situations of potential extortion. But at the same time, when we're talking about harms related to the use of IPEDs, if one of our concerns is with product sterility, product quality, if people can't rationally make a decision to switch product because they don't realise that this brand they're looking to change away from is the same as the one they're looking to change to, could that be an actual issue arising? You know, could that be a danger? So in relation to product harms, moving away from my paper briefly, in my thesis I actually talked about these cases where a few users actually highlighted their negative experiences with particular products which caused them to switch brands. So these are both powerlifters, but I did have other people, more casual gym users, who similarly had a bad experience and said, I realised that that was a dodgy batch and I had to move on to something else. So Martin, talking about his experience, says he injected into his glute and I got cellulitis, which is an infection under the skin. I've been shown how to inject everything. The nurse was there, my girlfriend's mum, she watched it, she said it can't come from the needle or my hands, everything had been sterilised. That's dodgy shit. So it was from the vial wasn't sterile and he got this infection. And he was saying, that's really dodgy shit, so I made sure I changed to a pharma brand after that. And of course, as I showed you earlier, not all pharma brands actually are pharmaceutical grade product. That being said, Martin was a very informed powerlifter, so he would have been aware of this. So he probably did get actual pharma. On the other hand, Rich, not quite so bad an experience, but he started taking the GB Pharma Test 400, the Trem vial I showed you earlier, that I got that off Rich. He said that's horrible stuff. But he said just taking their testosterone, actually, I got really itchy on it. I started taking antihistamines every day. Apparently that lab's shit. What I've got online, just from typing in lab names, a lot of them, it's bathtub brew. It's not good stuff. And he sort of elaborated on that. Literally, it's made in somebody's bathtub. So in both of these cases, they had these negative experiences and they switched to a different lab. You know, Martin saying, I wanted to move to pharma stuff. Rich actually switched to Jim's product because he's also friends with Jim, knew he was a chemist, knew it was likely to be better quality product. But what about the people who maybe don't have the expertise that Martin did in knowing what real pharma is versus what's underground, or don't have the connections that Rich did? Are there going to be issues with their inability to make a rational choice to switch to a different brand if in fact a lot of bottles from a single lab contain different labels? With that being said, Kumar et al. Point out that actually it's important not to exaggerate drug harms. So let's actually talk about these rates. And I mentioned this in my thesis as well, that actually it might be the case that the perceived prevalence of this poor quality product, the bathtub brew, among users could be exaggerated. Because of course we saw it for heroin. Heroin suppliers were certain, oh yes, some people cut this dodgy stuff into it, but I would never do it. But everybody says the same thing, and none of the testing kind of indicates that there's any actual poisons being put in other than strychnine and heroin number 3, which facilitates the uptake when it's inhaled. Cohen spoke to cocaine users who all said, oh, often it's a lot of amphetamine cut in with cocaine and it's not pure cocaine. He tested 160 samples and none of it had amphetamine in. So there are certainly rumours that get started, that go around, and that can exaggerate, oh, these risks of certain drugs. So obviously Martin's experience, he did get an infection, he had a qualified registered nurse watching him, that probably was a legitimate dodgy vial. On the other hand, how many people who say, oh, I had pain after injecting, or something like that, oh, I had a rash come up. In many of those cases, maybe it was the injecting process itself. Maybe they got that wrong and attributed it to being bathtub brew. So I've noted in the IPED survey by Bates and McVeigh, 2016, only 2.1% of participants actually had abscesses and sores and this sort of thing, which would indicate actual infection. Some of the others, heat or pain, those could just be from the injecting process itself. So perhaps it's possible, even though it's very relevant to keep in mind that there clearly is some bad product on the market, maybe this is exaggerated when we're talking to users, and indeed even suppliers. Rich and Martin both engaged in social supply within their gyms. So I've sort of drawn on Ross Coomer's work again, and he says that actually one of the issues that came up when talking to heroin suppliers was they were guilty of mixing knowledge with myths when they were discussing harms. And I wonder if IPED users do the same, and they might exaggerate or misinterpret certain harms, and perhaps there isn't as much poor quality as in unsterile product in the local market as they perceive. Although, as Coomer et al.'s quantitative testing showed, there is poor quality product in that it's way below the stated dose. Although I do explore that in my thesis as well, if anyone wants to read my take on that. So it's important not to exaggerate drug harms, but at the same time, if these issues do occur, as Martin seems to have had a legitimate issue, even if it is only 2.1% of participants, is it anti-consumer practice? Is it causing more harms? Do we need to be aware of these issues with labelling of product? If one lab has product out under a bunch of different names, because it's in fact the guys who sell to the gyms, to the bodybuilders, who are putting the labels on, not the labs themselves. So moving back away from product harms, let's just talk about actually the nature of supply itself. Because as I said, gym level supply, when you buy from a gym owner, when you buy from a bodybuilder or something, it's very much social supply. There's all these kind of customer-oriented trust mechanisms to kind of make sure, Coomer and Salinas talk about, there was a gym owner who would say, oh no, just wait for this product to come in because this will be a bit better quality than that. And they were quite helpful in this manner. And what I found interesting was actually there were some examples of this even at the wholesale level. Gym brewing it up and then supplying it to people who then supplied it on in gyms. And he said even at this level, actually, he was at times quite customer service focused. So although a lot of the complaints he heard of were people saying, oh, it's underdosed or it's fake, and he said in those cases he would ignore it and just be like, take your business elsewhere then. Actually, if he did have legitimate complaints, then he would do everything he could to make sure that the customers were happy. So he said, there was an example of occasionally a batch of vials would be shipped out containing a little too much alcohol, because when they were trying to get the powders to blend into the oils, they'd had to add a little too much. And this made it painful to inject, even though completely sterile. It was just the pain was an issue. So he said in those cases, he would just say, keep all the vials you've already bought from me, I'll give you free replacements for all of those. So it kind of goes against some of the kind of public perceptions of how drug dealers operate, right? They're kind of builders, oh no, they're just these, nefarious Mr. Bigs who they just want the money, and actually Jim's saying, no, we deliberately went out of our way to try and make sure our customers stayed happy. He gave also the example of freebies, where he was saying, I didn't do it much, it was only the odd vial, but actually people were like, oh, what if I buy it and it's not very good, I'm not sure if it's worth the money, and he would say, look, just take it, try it, and then if it is good, give me what you think it's worth. So another practice that we see in social supply, and we see in these lower levels of supply, just very interesting to observe at the wholesale level. Kind of goes against some of those myths about drug dealers and about how it's all hegemonic and it's all very structured hierarchies and not at all consumer focused. And actually, Jim's experience seems to indicate the opposite. So I've noted, obviously there's plenty of literature on this, Ross Coomer's work and sort of his associations with other writers in relation to what we tend to think of as illicit drugs, but in the steroid market as well. Van der Ven and Coenraad talk about the online supply, and actually how some of the online pharmacies that you can buy from are very much engaged in these customer-oriented practices. In contrast to what my work on bodybuilding forums had to say, they were all very sceptical of online pharmacies, so interesting to see that debate. But certainly at the wholesale level in the local market, it does seem there is some consumer focus. Now, in relation to market myths or potential myths, before we finish, I wanted to touch on this idea of is there violence, is there danger in this market? Because we all have this perception that drug markets are violent, right? And obviously in relation to heroin and so on, Kumar and Mayer have said it's not always the case. There's a lot of cultural factors. Fleetwood talking about women crack dealers not engaging in violence in the way that male crack dealers do. So I thought it was interesting to explore this aspect of the IPED market. So I spoke to Jim about this, and as I mentioned, there was another lab operating in very close proximity to his. The towns were sort of 30 minutes apart. And I asked him about this, like if there were these other operations, was there any danger if you had this kind of rivalry of who gets to sell? And he said, no, actually there were several small operations in the area, but we coexisted for a while, and they came and went all the time. No real logic behind why they disappeared, but there was no real worry. They would report us to any authorities. And I just found that quite really interesting, that I had asked him, oh, was there any danger or any rivalry? And he didn't even think to comment on violence. He was like, nah, there's no worry, they'd report us to the police. Like he didn't even consider violence an option. It was just, oh, do I have to worry about the authorities if they report me? And saying that wasn't a big concern. So I found that a very interesting response, and I actually pressed him. I said, what about violence? What kind of violence is associated with this market? Because people will talk about it. And he said, no, any violence that occurs is crossover to other drug markets, because you get people who sell cocaine and then they also sell steroids on the side, just because they're a drug dealer and therefore they like to have all the products that people might ask them for. And particularly if you're selling cocaine to like nightclub doormen or whatever, these are probably people who want steroids as well. So his implication was actually if you just look at people who just deal in steroids, there's no violence. And certainly from my very limited experience, I had Tyson, who had moved from Class A supply and come over to steroid supply, seemed to be quite a threatening, intimidating guy, whereas Jim seemed completely the opposite, because he had come through powerlifting and drifted into steroid supply. So I thought that was a very interesting finding. Now, this could just be a geographical quirk. We're talking about a city with less than 250,000 people, whereas Tyson was up in Birmingham, a lot more people. So maybe there are those sort of geographical issues involved. But nonetheless, it does show that some of these perceptions of risks of illicit markets might be oversimplifications, and we need to pay attention to that sort of nuance. So, to sort of summarise the key implications, I think that particularly when we're looking at Jim's experience of ordering online, the fact that back in 2012, these Chinese labs clearly had experience of shipping products to the UK, it shows that work showing that there are these hubs in sort of other nations, such as Llewellyn and Toba, saying, oh, people would then buy it to Thailand and then that would get sent on and that would get... That doesn't seem to be the case now. It seems to be a lot more direct ordering from actual legitimate pharmaceutical labs in countries such as China and India. And I think Jim's experience of navigating the importation cross-border supply really shows that. And that was going on in 2012. Obviously, his operation was going on even earlier than that. If he was saying, oh, customs ramped up in 2012, I didn't ask him the precise date when he started. Kind of shows that actually this has been in place for some years, and when we're seeing more awareness of the home brewing phenomenon, when we're looking at bodybuilding forums, and when my online Market for Steroids book comes out, which you should all buy, they all talked about home brewing there, and this was work conducted in sort of 2015, I think it was. So clearly, this is something worth paying attention to, how cross-border supply occurs and how homebrewing occurs. Now, Jim's experiences running a lab helps explain some of those findings in relation to product quality from Kummer et al. Right? It shows you that actually, when you have a chemistry background, you can be aware of some of the issues that might go wrong, that might cause these problems with the end user product. So I think that really informs that debate. And in terms of the harm debate, I think what I took you through in terms of the labeling of product, that it's not the labs themselves, it says this lab, it comes from Deutsche Pharma, it comes from Infinity, it comes from whomever. Often that isn't the case, and it's the guy one level below who's putting the labels on to then sell to the gym owners, who then sell to the end user. So I think all of those things are very relevant to keep in mind, in addition to the drug myths I covered towards the end there. So if anybody has any questions now, I'm happy to take them. I think that's a really interesting question. Thank you. So in terms of what we've been looking at in trends of use, it seems to have really come up with kind of particularly the current trends in like aesthetics culture and the obsession with like the Love Island body and having the perfect profile pic. Quite a few people have written on that. Van de Ven and Mulrooney explicitly wrote about this idea of wanting to be buff for your profile pictures because of what you're exposed to in media and Love Island and so on. And then people have more broadly talked about the culture without necessarily talking about steroids. So Hakeem has talked about this spornosexual, this idea that what's fashionable on social media is this blend between sporting and the body seen in porn, almost this kind of blending of erotic and muscular and ripped. So long as that cultural trend continues, I think steroid use will keep increasing. But I think probably this is kind of like a fashion, and that will start to die off. People will almost become overexposed to this obsession with fitness models on Instagram and so on. So I could foresee just naturally there being a decline in steroid use once that culture dies down. So I think it kind of depends on how much social status remains being attached to having that particular body being able to show off that lifestyle. Well, steroids themselves, obviously much more by men, particularly because they have quite masculinizing side effects. And there's been some interesting work on that, actually, and how kind of women bodybuilders particularly navigate the kind of almost crossing gender norms. So Linda Johnston's written about that, Tanya Bunsell has. But in terms of other IPEDs, I would be interested to see. I think things like melanotan, the tanning drug, probably a lot of women using that. Obviously fat burners, I think a lot of women take those as well. So in terms of what we tend to be exposed to when we're looking at harm reduction programs, people coming into needle and syringe exchanges, it's overwhelmingly men, because they tend to be the ones who are using the actual steroids and need the injections. Whereas women, only the only really injectable one they seem to be using a lot is melanotan. But it would be interesting if there were some work on kind of other things such as fat burners and actually what the precise gendered differences are. I think that it's very interesting, kind of, it ties in with what I was saying before about the culture, and you've mentioned that it's on Instagram. But yeah, it is this real thing of commercialism of sporting bodies and also erotic bodies used to sell certain supplements, take this and you'll be this way. And as you said, a lot of those teas and things, sometimes it's just they're powerful laxatives and just basically drain your system. So you look great as long as you're on it, immediately you come off and then you blow back up. Some of them, it's kind of worse because there's this fat burner you can take, and people don't necessarily think of it as they would like an illicit drug similar to steroids. So things like clenbuterol, I think people are taking that without kind of registering, oh, this might have these harmful side effects. So the bodybuilders who used to use it, who kind of made it become norm in gyms, they were aware, oh, these have bad side effects. Whereas I had a case in my research, I spoke to a gym owner who said there was a female client at his gym who was just overweight, and she just went online like Good Fat Burner or something and bought clenbuterol and was just using that. And she did lose a lot of weight, but clenbuterol has all kinds of side effects on like your eyes and your heart and all these things. So I don't have the kind of precise figures on that, but I would think that with that kind of cultural trend towards you have to look this certain way and that's what gets you status on social media, probably there are harms that will come just with those more generic supplements outside of steroids. Yeah, and that's a really interesting thing. That's my thesis when I was talking about normalization. We've seen normalization in bodybuilding and powerlifting competitions for some time, where it's just been the norm within those cultures. But when we're talking about kind of, trends on Instagram and trends towards having a certain body to show off, people are kind of competing for that social status on social media. So actually, Pete, who I spoke to in my work, who was part of like lad culture, and part of that is showing off the beach pics when they're in Ibiza and all that, and he said, yeah, I think a lot of the steroid use there is linked to this kind of competition for social media likes and approval. So certainly I think as long as this cultural trend continues, then absolutely, I think it's going to be more and more pressures on young men to use steroids, and young women different pressures, but still linked to those cultural trends. The trends in like gym outfits. You have to wear the really fashionable brand, and you have to put makeup on to go to the gym and things like that. So different pressures, but I think very much linked to this idea of competition. And at the Australian Sociological Association, I actually did a presentation on kind of the economics underlying that competition. So that's on YouTube if you want to check it out. What I would be interested to see is more informed staff in gyms on these issues, because I've spoken to some personal trainers who are aware of all the harms, they're aware of what the safe protocols for use are, and they can kind of guide people away from using the drugs harmfully. Whereas others, they kind of encourage people, yeah man, take this, you'll get huge, and so on. And I think that is a real cultural problem that needs to be addressed. So maybe my focus would be, rather than, cracking down on steroid availability in gyms, because people just sell it in the car park. There was a gym I used to go to, a guy had a car wash outside, and people come up, oh, I want my car washed, wink, leave the money in the car, and he would leave steroid vials in there. So I think the supply is going to continue no matter what. So I would like to see sort of a program of, let's make sure the actual gym staff and personal trainers really know what they're talking about, and maybe what they should be advising is just getting people away from harmful use. That would probably be my personal preference for policy. And I wrote an essay on that, if anyone wants to buy my essays book. Does anyone have anything related to sort of the market specifically, and what we went through in relation to Jim's experiences? I would say, from my experience of only talking to sort of 2 proper commercial suppliers, I think it's almost the other way around. It's now that steroids is becoming the thing, and that's what people are demanding. I think we're going to see more people like Tyson, who started off selling ketamine and coke, and said, oh wait, why am I risking being put in prison for all these years selling this, when I could still be making this money just distributing steroids? So I would assume that's probably more likely what we're going to see, but certainly there is some overlap with, drug dealers selling steroids in addition to harder drugs. But I don't think we're going to see people, tell a lie. We will see people like Jim selling certain other illicit drugs. So benzodiazepines, things like that, things that might help you with the side effects of steroids that are illicit for completely unrelated reasons. I think you will see people drift into that type of supply. I think people who just casually, socially supply in gyms, they probably know how to get benzos, and they probably supply those because of, the attributed effects to steroids that benzos and things like that will be able to help with. But I don't think they'll then move into cocaine unless they were already kind of involved in that scene, would be my guess. All right, well, thanks very much for participating, everybody who asked questions. I appreciate that.